In the winter of 1867, a boss named Samuel Hartwell sent his last message from the Union Pacific's Camp 17, hidden deep in Utah's snowy mountains. The message had only 7 words: "We need supplies badly." Men eating each other. 3 days later, when the rescue team finally got to the work camp through 12 feet of snow, they found the cooking fires still burning, steam coming up from huge iron pots filled with what looked like stew. But out of the 127 workers who had been living there, only 18 were still alive. And they found them hiding in the supply shed, their eyes wild with fear, refusing to talk about what had kept them alive through the terrible mountain winter. The railroad company quickly locked away all records of Camp 17, and for over 100 years, families of the missing workers were told their loved ones had simply walked away into the wilderness. But recently found company letters show a horror so planned, so carefully done that it changes everything we thought we knew about America's move west. Before we continue with the story of Camp 17 and the men who disappeared into those boiling pots, I want you to take a moment to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We're about to uncover one of the most disturbing stories in American railroad history. And I'd love to know which state you're listening from in the comments below. The truth about what happened in those Utah mountains during the winter of 1867 would stay buried under layers of company secrets and government lies for many years. But the proof we've found shows a picture of planned cruelty that makes the Donner Party look like a Sunday picnic. Camp 17 showed everything ambitious and mean about America's race to finish the railroad across the country. Built in September 1867, along a dangerous stretch of track through Utah's mountains, the camp housed 127 men whose job was to blast through solid rock and lay rails across land that had killed countless people before them. The Union Pacific Railroad, fighting hard with the Central Pacific to get the most money from the government, had pushed construction deeper into the mountains than any smart engineer would suggest, driven by the promise of $48,000 for each mile of track laid through mountain areas for years. Almost 3 times the pay for flatland construction, the camp itself showed industrial determination and human desperation. Canvas tents and quickly built wooden buildings sat in a narrow valley between tall peaks that rose over 8,000 feet above sea level, while the constant thunder of dynamite echoed off canyon walls as work crews blasted their way through ancient stone formations that had stood unchanged since before. People could remember the site had been chosen not because it was a good place to live, but because it was in the right spot along the planned route, forcing the workers to carve their living space from a landscape that seemed to hate human presence. Most of the workers were Irish people running from the effects of the Great Famine, joined by soldiers who had fought in the Civil War and carried the mental scars of battles like Gettysburg and Antietam, and freed slaves looking for opportunity in the expanding West, where the color of a man's skin mattered less than his willingness to risk his life for railroad pay. They worked for $2.50 a day when wages were paid, which became less and less common as the railroad company sent funds to stockholders rather than supporting remote work crews. The mixed crew spoke in different languages, creating a mix of voices that somehow managed to coordinate the dangerous work of mountain railroad construction. Leading this desperate group of workers was Samuel Hartwell, a former Union Army supply officer whose organization skills had impressed railroad bosses in Omaha. During a brief meeting where he'd explained his ideas on managing large crews under bad conditions. At 43, Hartwell looked like a military man with steel gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to notice every detail around him, from the daily amount of rock moved to the small signs of unhappiness among his workers. His military experience had taught him that good leadership required keeping authority through a mix of respect and fear, a lesson that would prove sadly important during the coming winter. Beside him worked his assistant boss, Thomas Kincaid, a Dublin-born giant who stood nearly 6.5 feet tall and could swing a 20-pound sledgehammer for 12 hours straight while still having energy to break up fights in the evening. Kincaid had earned his position through raw physical strength and a natural understanding of worker psychology that let him calm tensions before they exploded into violence. His huge hands, scarred from years of hard work, could be gentle enough to bandage a small injury or brutal enough to discipline a troublemaker, depending on what the situation needed. The camp's cook, Wilhelm Brenner, had followed the pattern of German immigration west from Pennsylvania, bringing with him impressive knowledge of preserving meat and stretching small food supplies to feed large crews during his service with a Pennsylvania regiment that had spent months under attack. During the war, Brenner's pale blue eyes held an intensity that some workers found scary, and his habit of studying each man's physical condition with the calculating look of a butcher looking at livestock had been noticed, but dismissed as professional thoroughness. His cook tent was organized like the military, every knife sharp enough to shave with, and every pot scrubbed to a gleaming finish that showed his obsessive attention to cleanliness and efficiency. By October 1867, signs of trouble were already appearing like cracks in a dam that would eventually burst with terrible force. Supply trains that should have arrived weekly began arriving sometimes 2 or 3 weeks apart, carrying partial loads that seemed to have been picked over before reaching Camp 17. The railroad company, facing money pressure from investors worried about cost overruns and government watching of their money claims, had quietly begun sending supply shipments to camps closer to civilization, leaving remote outposts like Camp 17 to take care of themselves with whatever scraps remained after more accessible crews had been supplied. When confronted by telegraph about the supply shortages, company bosses in Omaha sent back short responses about temporary logistics adjustments and promised camp leadership that full provisions would resume shortly pending resolution of transportation difficulties. The responses carried an undertone of barely hidden irritation, as if the mountain workers were being unreasonably demanding by expecting regular food deliveries during a harsh Utah winter. The men began adding to their shrinking food by hunting the few deer and elk that remained in the area. But game had been largely driven away by months of constant blasting and construction noise that echoed through the valleys like continuous thunder. The local wildlife had either fled to quieter regions or been killed off by previous hunting trips, leaving the surrounding mountains as empty of animal life as they were of human habitation. By November, the standard daily food had been reduced from 3 meals to 2, then to 1 meal plus whatever the men could find from the increasingly empty landscape that offered little beyond pine needles and bitter mountain herbs. Tempers flared as hunger ate at the crew like a constant grinding pain that made every small irritation feel like a major insult. Fights broke out over card games and imagined slights that would have been laughed off under normal circumstances, with men who had previously worked together peacefully suddenly viewing each other as competitors for scarce resources. The evening gatherings around the cook fires, once filled with songs and stories from the old country, became tense affairs where workers eyed each other's portions and counted every bite with the calculating attention of accountants tracking valuable assets. Yet even as conditions got worse with each passing day, the pressure from company headquarters to maintain construction schedules never let up, arriving in daily telegrams that demanded progress reports and threatened wage cuts or replacement by other crews if productivity declined. Daily quotas for track laying and rock removal remained unchanged, despite the reduced workforce efficiency caused by malnutrition and the increasing difficulty of working in below-freezing temperatures that made metal tools painful to handle and turned exhaled breath into clouds of ice crystals. That ice crystals blocked vision. The men found themselves trapped between the advancing winter that grew more brutal with each passing week, shrinking food supplies that seemed to decrease regardless of careful rationing, and corporate masters who seemed utterly disconnected from the reality of mountain construction work. The company's demands felt like messages from another planet, written by men who had never felt the bite of mountain wind or the exhaustion of swinging a pickaxe at granite while fighting altitude, sickness, and chronic hunger. The first death came on November 23, 1867, during what should have been a routine blasting operation in the granite face that had been resisting their efforts for nearly 2 weeks. Patrick Sullivan, a 24-year-old from County Cork, whose cheerful personality had made him popular among the Irish workers, was positioning charges in a crack when an early explosion brought down several tons of rock in a thunderous cascade that shook the entire valley. The blast occurred without warning, suggesting either a bad fuse or contaminated powder, though the exact cause would never be determined due to the destruction of physical evidence. Sullivan's screams echoed through the mountain air for nearly an hour, growing progressively weaker as shock and blood loss took their toll. But when the crew finally managed to clear enough debris to reach him, they found his body crushed beyond recognition. Every bone had been shattered by the immense weight of falling granite, organs crushed into a gruesome paste that stained the rocks around him with dark patches that would remain visible for weeks. His face, once animated by an infectious smile that could lighten the mood of the entire crew, was now unrecognizable, transformed into something that barely resembled human features. What happened next would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives, though few would ever speak of it publicly or even acknowledge their memories in private conversations. As the men stood around Sullivan's mangled remains in stunned silence, discussing the grim practicalities of burial in ground that had been frozen solid for weeks, Cook Wilhelm Brenner stepped forward with an expression that several witnesses later described as curious, rather than horrified. His pale eyes studied the wreckage with the same professional attention he usually reserved for examining sides of beef delivered by the supply trains. Brenner knelt beside the body, his weathered hands moving with surprising gentleness as he examined the extent of the damage and calculated what portions might still be usable despite the traumatic injuries. His assessment was conducted with the methodical precision of a man who had spent years evaluating meat quality under various conditions, from battlefield casualties to livestock slaughtered under less than ideal circumstances. "There's still good meat here," Brenner announced in his thick German accent, his words cutting through the mountain air like a knife blade through silence. "Waste not, want not. That's what we learned during the siege of Vicksburg when we had to make every scrap count." The assembled workers stared in stunned silence as Brenner began efficiently separating usable flesh from the damaged areas, his butcher's knife moving with practiced precision that spoke of years spent processing various types of meat under pressure. "This boy gave his life for the railroad," Brenner continued matter-of-factly, never pausing in his grisly examination. "Least we can do is not let him feed the wolves and bears that prowl these mountains, looking for easy meals." His voice carried no trace of madness or desperation, only the practical tone of a professional solving a logistical problem with the tools and resources available. Thomas Kincaid was the first to voice what everyone was thinking, his massive frame trembling slightly as he struggled to process what he was witnessing. "Jesus Christ, Wilhelm, you can't be serious about this madness." But Brenner's pale blue eyes held no trace of insanity or moral confusion, only the calculating look of a man solving a practical problem with the efficiency that had made him valuable to the railroad company. "I've served horse meat to cavalry units, rat stew to siege survivors, and boiled leather to men who would have died otherwise," Brenner replied, never pausing in his systematic work. "This is fresher than anything we've had in weeks. And Patrick here was a healthy young man who took good care of himself." The cook's voice carried an almost teaching tone, as if he were explaining basic principles of nutrition and resource management to students who had failed to grasp obvious concepts. Samuel Hartwell faced the most crucial decision of his life, one that would define not only his own fate, but the destiny of every man under his command. As foreman, he possessed the authority to put a stop to Brenner's proposal immediately. But he was also acutely aware that their last supply train was now 3 weeks overdue. Their remaining provisions would last perhaps another 10 days if carefully rationed. And the weather reports from passing telegraph operators suggested the mountain passes would remain impassable until April at the earliest. The railroad company had effectively abandoned them to their fate. Winter was tightening its grip on the mountains like a giant fist closing around their isolated camp, and 126 men were looking to him for leadership that might keep them alive until spring brought relief. The weight of command had never felt heavier than it did in that moment, standing over Sullivan's broken body while his starving crew waited for a decision that would either preserve their humanity or ensure their survival. The silence stretched for what felt like hours as the men waited for Hartwell's decision, their breath forming clouds of vapor in the frigid air, while snow began falling in large, soft flakes that would soon cover Sullivan's blood-stained corpse. Finally, Hartwell gave a barely perceptible nod, and Brenner resumed his work with renewed efficiency and what might have been the faintest hint of satisfaction in his pale eyes. Within 2 hours, portions of Patrick Sullivan had joined the evening stew, mixed with their dwindling supply of potatoes and onions to mask both the texture and taste of what they were consuming. Brenner had worked with remarkable skill to disguise the meat's origin, seasoning it heavily with wild herbs he claimed to have found near the partially frozen stream and cutting it into small pieces that could be mistaken for game meat by men hungry enough to avoid asking uncomfortable questions. Most of the men claimed they couldn't bring themselves to heat the stew, standing around the cook fires with their bowls untouched while they wrestled with moral objections that seemed increasingly abstract compared to the immediate reality of their empty stomachs. But by morning, every bowl had been scraped clean, and several workers quietly asked Brenner if there might be more of the same mountain game available for future meals. That night, several workers reported hearing sounds from the cook tent that would become horribly familiar over the coming weeks. The rhythmic thunk of cleaver against cutting board, the scrape of knife against bone, and Brenner's voice humming old German folk songs as he worked through the night processing what remained of their former companion. The sounds continued until nearly dawn, accompanied by the crackling of fires and the occasional splash of water as Brenner cleaned his tools and work surfaces with the same meticulous attention to hygiene that had characterized his cooking throughout the construction season. When the men emerged for breakfast the next morning, they found their usual porridge supplemented with what Brenner called mountain sausage, densely packed links with a texture none of them recognized, but a taste that satisfied their growing hunger more completely than anything they'd eaten in weeks. The sausage had been seasoned and spiced so skillfully that it bore no resemblance to its grim source, and several workers complimented the cook on his ability to create such satisfying fare from their limited resources. The transformation of Camp 17 began gradually, almost imperceptibly, like a slow poison working its way through the collective soul of the work crew until it had infected every aspect of their daily existence. Within days of Sullivan's death, the men noticed that their energy levels had improved dramatically despite the harsh conditions that should have been sapping their strength. The constant gnawing hunger that had plagued them for weeks seemed to have vanished, replaced by a sense of satisfaction and physical vigor that none of them had felt since early autumn when supplies were still arriving regularly. Wilhelm Brenner, meanwhile, had taken on an almost mystical authority within the camp hierarchy that extended far beyond his official role as cook. Men who had previously dismissed him as just another immigrant tradesman now sought his approval and advice on matters ranging from work assignments to personal disputes, treating his opinions with the deference typically reserved for religious leaders or military commanders. He moved through the camp with a new confidence that bordered on arrogance, his pale eyes studying each worker with the same calculating assessment he had once reserved for cuts of meat delivered by the supply trains. When asked about his seemingly endless ability to stretch their provisions and maintain the crew's improved nutrition, despite the ongoing supply crisis, Brenner would simply smile and tap his temple with one weathered finger. "Waste not, want not," he would repeat like a mantra. "There's always more where you'd least expect it if you know how to look and aren't squeamish about taking advantage of opportunities when they present themselves." The second death occurred on December 7th when veteran railroad worker Marcus Holloway suffered what appeared to be a massive heart attack while hauling timber from the cutting area to the construction site. Unlike Sullivan's gruesome demise under tons of granite, Holloway's death was clean and peaceful. The 40-year-old Ohio native simply dropped his load mid-step, clutched his chest with both hands, and collapsed to the frozen ground where he died within minutes, despite the efforts of Dr. Edwin Cartwright to revive him. Holloway had been a steady, reliable worker whose experience with railroad construction dated back to the early expansion projects in the Midwest, making his sudden death a genuine shock to his fellow workers who had come to depend on his knowledge and leadership in technical matters. His loss represented not just another mouth to feed, but the elimination of valuable expertise that would be difficult to replace in their isolated circumstances. But this time there was no debate about what to do with the body, no shocked silence or moral wrestling with unthinkable options. Before anyone could suggest alternatives like burial or preservation until spring, Brenner was already sharpening his knives with the methodical care of a craftsman preparing for important work. The cook's response had become so routine that several workers began helping him transport the body to his processing area without being asked, as if they were simply following established protocol for handling workplace fatalities. Marcus was a good worker who understood the value of efficiency, Brenner announced as he began his familiar routine, his hands moving with increased skill and speed that spoke of recent practice. He'd want to keep helping the crew even now, contributing to our survival in the only way that's still possible for him. The men watched with a mixture of horror and fascination as Brenner worked, noting his increasing expertise in the grim art of human butchery and the almost artistic precision with which he separated useful meat from less desirable portions. What had taken him hours with Sullivan's mangled corpse required barely 1 hour with Holloway's intact body, and the results were noticeably superior in both quantity and quality. Brenner had developed techniques for maximizing the yield from each victim, utilizing organs and portions that might have been discarded during his earlier, less experienced efforts. His growing expertise was evident in every aspect of the process, from the efficiency of his cutting to the creative ways he disguised the final product. More disturbing than Brenner's technical improvement was the crew's growing acceptance of their new dietary reality, which had evolved from desperate necessity to something approaching enthusiasm. When the evening stew was served, seasoned with wild herbs that Brenner claimed to have found near the frozen stream, but which some suspected he was cultivating in secret locations around the camp, the men ate with genuine appetite rather than the forced necessity they had felt before. Some workers even complimented the cook on the improved flavor and texture of their enhanced rations, praising his ability to make their special provisions taste better with each preparation and asking if he might be able to obtain more of the same high-quality ingredients. The psychological distance between their former lives and their current reality had widened to the point where they could discuss cannibalism in the euphemistic language of restaurant patrons evaluating a particularly successful meal. But Foreman Samuel Hartwell was beginning to notice patterns that troubled him deeply, even as he recognized his own complicity in establishing the system that made those patterns possible. The deaths, which had initially seemed like unfortunate accidents typical of dangerous railroad construction work, were occurring with suspicious regularity, roughly every 10 to 12 days. Just as their enhanced rations were beginning to run low and the men started showing signs of renewed hunger and decreased energy. More disturbing still was the subtle change in how the men interacted with each other during work hours and evening gatherings. Conversations had become guarded and calculating, with workers eyeing their companions not as fellow laborers sharing common hardships, but as potential threats to their own survival or potential resources for addressing future food shortages. The easy camaraderie that had once characterized the crew's relationships had been replaced by a constant state of wariness that made every interaction feel like a negotiation. The third death, that of Irish immigrant Seamus O'Brien on December 19th, removed any lingering doubts about the trajectory their isolated community was following and marked the point where accident gave way to deliberate action. O'Brien, a typically robust 28-year-old who had never shown signs of illness or weakness, allegedly slipped on ice while carrying blasting powder from the storage area to the work site and struck his head on a granite outcropping with enough force to cause fatal injuries. The injury was severe, but not immediately fatal. Yet when his fellow workers found him 20 minutes later, O'Brien was dead, his skull crushed by what appeared to be repeated blows from a heavy instrument rather than a single impact from falling. The blood spatter pattern and the condition of the alleged ice patch told a story that contradicted the official explanation, but no one seemed interested in conducting a thorough investigation. Thomas Quincaid, investigating the scene with a thoroughness his position required, discovered that the ice patch where O'Brien supposedly slipped showed no signs of disturbance that would be consistent with a fall, and the blood spatter pattern suggested the fatal injuries had occurred while the victim was lying on the ground rather than standing upright. The evidence pointed clearly toward deliberate murder. But when Kincaid brought these observations to Hartwell, the foreman's response was telling in its brevity and finality. Hartwell ordered Kincaid to keep his suspicions to himself and help Brenner prepare the evening meal, making it clear that official investigations into workplace accidents were less important than maintaining crew morale and ensuring adequate nutrition during the difficult winter months. The foreman's decision marked the point where leadership shifted from maintaining order to actively participating in systematic murder. That night, as the men gathered around their cook fires with unusual enthusiasm and anticipation, a horrible realization began crystallizing in the minds of the few who still retained enough moral clarity to see what was happening to their community. They were no longer survivors adapting to desperate circumstances with regrettable but necessary compromises. They had become participants in systematic murder, with each death carefully timed to maintain their food supply through the long mountain winter that stretched ahead like an eternity of hunger and cold. The isolation of Camp 17 during the winter of 1867-68 created a laboratory for human degradation that would have horrified even the most hardened observers of frontier brutality, transforming ordinary working men into something that challenged the basic assumptions of civilized society. As December faded into January with no sign of rescue or resupply, the remaining 124 workers had settled into a routine that combined backbreaking labor with carefully orchestrated death, all overseen by the increasingly powerful trio of Hartwell, Kincaid, and Brenner, who had assumed roles that went far beyond their official positions. The selection process had become almost ritualistic in its precision and deliberate cruelty. Every 10 days, Brenner would appear at the morning meal with what he called his nutrition assessment, a clipboard and pencil in hand, as he carefully studied each worker's physical condition, productivity levels, and most chillingly, their social connections within the group. Workers who kept to themselves, who had no close friends among the crew, or who showed signs of weakness or illness, found themselves assigned to the most dangerous tasks with an efficiency that suggested careful planning rather than random chance. The assignment seemed reasonable on the surface, handling unstable explosives that required steady hands and clear thinking, working alone in unstable tunnel sections where cave-ins were common, or maintaining equipment near the treacherous cliff edges where a single misstep could result in a fatal fall. But the pattern was unmistakable to anyone who paid attention. The men selected for these dangerous duties were invariably those who would be least missed by their fellow workers and whose deaths would cause the minimum disruption to camp morale. What made the system so insidiously effective was its veneer of practical necessity and professional competence. When 23-year-old German immigrant Friedrich Koller was found dead at the bottom of a ravine on January 2nd, allegedly having fallen while checking survey markers in an area known for unstable footing, his death was treated as another tragic accident in an inherently dangerous profession. Koller had been isolated within the camp due to language barriers and cultural differences, making him an ideal candidate for elimination, according to Brenner's utilitarian calculus. Brenner's immediate response to each death had become so routine that none of the workers even questioned it anymore, accepting his presence at accident scenes as natural as a doctor responding to medical emergencies. The cook would arrive with his specialized tools and begin his grisly work with an efficiency that suggested extensive experience, processing each victim with techniques that had been refined through practice and experimentation. The psychological transformation of the camp was perhaps more disturbing than the physical acts of cannibalism, representing a complete breakdown of the social bonds that had held the crew together during the early months of construction. Men who had once shared stories of their families back home, trading photographs and letters from loved ones during evening gatherings, now spoke only of work schedules and equipment maintenance with the mechanical precision of factory workers rather than human beings. The evening gatherings around the cook fires, once filled with songs and jokes that helped maintain morale during difficult times, had become silent affairs where workers consumed their enhanced rations with the mechanical efficiency of animals feeding at a trough. Trust had been replaced by a constant state of wariness, with each man calculating his own value to the group and assessing potential threats from his companions while trying to avoid behaviors that might mark him for elimination. Thomas Quincaid had embraced his role as chief enforcer with an enthusiasm that surprised even Samuel Hartwell, who had initially viewed the Dublin giant as a useful subordinate rather than a true partner in their enterprise. Quincaid seemed to take genuine pleasure in the selection process, approaching potential victims with the same methodical patience he had once applied to railroad construction tasks, studying their habits and weaknesses with the focused attention of a predator choosing prey. When young Irish immigrant Daniel McCarthy began showing signs of exhaustion and malnutrition in mid-January, displaying the hollow-eyed look and trembling hands that marked him as a liability to the crew's productivity, Quincaid appointed himself McCarthy's constant companion and helper. The assistant foreman offered assistance with heavy lifting and provided seemingly genuine friendship during a time when social isolation could be fatal, creating a false sense of security that made the eventual betrayal more effective. 3 days later, McCarthy was found crushed beneath a load of timber that had allegedly shifted during transport from the cutting area to the construction site, with Quincaid conveniently present to witness the accident and help extract the body from beneath the heavy logs. The timing was perfect, occurring just as the camp's enhanced food supplies were running low and the men were beginning to show signs of renewed hunger and decreased energy. The camp's medical officer, Dr. Edwin Cartwright, had initially attempted to document what he suspected were deliberate killings, maintaining detailed notes about the circumstances surrounding each death and the inconsistencies in the official explanation. His medical training had taught him to observe evidence objectively and draw logical conclusions from physical facts, making him potentially dangerous to the system that Hartwell and his associates had established. But by late January, even Cartwright had succumbed to the prevailing madness that had infected every aspect of camp life, his medical oath overwhelmed by the brutal pragmatism of survival and the psychological pressure of prolonged isolation. When he examined the body of railroad worker Giuseppe Bellacourt on January 24th, another alleged accident victim whose injuries were inconsistent with the described circumstances, Cartwright simply noted death by misadventure in his log and helped Brenner transport the corpse to the cook tent without conducting the thorough investigation that his training demanded. The most chilling aspect of Camp 17's transformation was how completely normal the systematic murder and cannibalism had begun to feel to the surviving workers, who had adapted to their new reality with a psychological flexibility that would have been impossible to imagine under normal circumstances. Men who had once been horrified by the prospect of consuming human flesh now eagerly anticipated meal times, gathering around the cook fires with genuine enthusiasm while praising Brenner's culinary innovations and even making specific requests for particular preparations. The cook had developed an extensive repertoire of techniques for disguising the taster of human meat, incorporating wild seasonings and creative combinations that made their grim rations not just palatable but genuinely appetizing to men whose moral compass had been completely destroyed by hunger and desperation. Brenner's creativity in the kitchen had become a source of pride within the camp, with workers competing to offer compliments and suggestions for future meals, as if they were guests at a fine restaurant rather than participants in systematic cannibalism. The first crack in the carefully constructed facade of Camp 17's cannibalistic society appeared in early February, when Polish immigrant Kazimierz Kowalski made a discovery that would ultimately provide the most comprehensive record of the winter's atrocities. Kowalski, a former university student who had immigrated to America following political troubles in his homeland, possessed both the education and moral clarity necessary to document what was happening around him with scientific precision. While searching for usable materials in the abandoned equipment shed, Kowalski discovered a cache of personal belongings that told the true story of the camp's diminishing population. Watches, wedding rings, family photographs, and personal letters from dozens of workers who had allegedly wandered off or died in accidents were hidden beneath loose floorboards, creating a grim museum of the dead that contradicted every official explanation for their disappearances. Among the most damning evidence were detailed notes in Brenner's handwriting that catalogued each victim's physical characteristics, estimated meat yield, and preparation methods with the clinical precision of a scientific study. The cook had been conducting experiments in human butchery, refining his techniques and keeping careful records of which approaches produced the best results in terms of both quantity and palatability. Kowalski began maintaining his own secret record of events, writing in a mixture of Polish and English to avoid detection while documenting the systematic nature of the murders and the psychological transformation of his fellow workers. His diary entries provide chilling insights into the daily life of a community that had abandoned every principle of civilized behavior in favor of carefully organized survival cannibalism. February 8th. They took Michelson today, Kowalski wrote, in one entry. The poor Swedish boy never had a chance once Kincaid marked him for selection. Found him this morning with his skull crushed, same as the others. Brenner was already sharpening his knives before the body was cold. We'll eat well tonight, and tomorrow the cycle begins again with someone else marked for death. The discovery of additional evidence began to reveal the true scope of the conspiracy that had taken control of Camp 17. Hidden among Hartwell's papers, Kowalski found correspondence with railroad company officials that suggested the foreman had been reporting false information about the camp's population and condition, claiming that missing workers had deserted rather than died, thus avoiding any corporate responsibility for their fate. More disturbing still were indications that the systematic cannibalism had been planned rather than arising spontaneously from desperate circumstances. References to alternative food sources and creative resource management in early correspondence suggested that company officials were aware of what was happening and had chosen to ignore it rather than risk the expense and negative publicity of a rescue operation. By February 1868, the systematic nature of the killings had created an atmosphere of such pervasive terror that the remaining 87 workers had effectively segregated themselves into two distinct groups: the inner circle of Hartwell, Kincaid, Brenner, and their most trusted allies, who openly discussed their feeding schedule and victim selection criteria, and the increasingly desperate outer circle of workers who understood exactly what was happening, but felt powerless to stop it or escape from their mountain prison. The inner circle had developed elaborate justifications for their actions that went far beyond simple survival, creating a pseudo-intellectual framework that transformed murder and cannibalism into acts of rational resource management. During evening meetings in Hartwell's quarters, they spoke of their work in terms of natural selection and social Darwinism, arguing that they were creating a superior workforce by eliminating the weak and inefficient members of their community. Brenner, whose education had included some exposure to scientific theories popular in European universities, provided pseudo-intellectual backing for their cannibalistic practices with lectures on nutrition and human physiology that claimed consuming the flesh of fellow humans provided superior protein and even psychological benefits. We're becoming something stronger than ordinary men, Brenner explained to his increasingly devoted followers during one particularly chilling gathering in early February. Each man we process makes us more resilient, more capable of surviving conditions that would destroy workers who cling to outdated moral restriction. The group had begun keeping detailed records of their meals that went far beyond simple documentation, noting which victims had provided the most satisfactory nutrition, which preparation methods yielded the best results, and even recording the psychological effects of consuming different types of human flesh. Brenner had even begun experimenting with preservation techniques borrowed from his military experience, smoking and salting human flesh to create supplies that could last longer between kills and provide variety in their diet. The outer circle, meanwhile, lived in constant terror of being selected for the next accident, knowing that any sign of weakness or social isolation could mark them for death. Workers began sleeping in shifts, with trusted companions keeping watch through the night while others rested, creating an atmosphere of paranoia and sleeplessness that further weakened their physical and mental resistance to the horror surrounding them. Some attempted to form alliances for mutual protection, But these efforts were consistently undermined by the harsh reality that any group large enough to resist the inner circle would also be large enough to threaten the food supply that was keeping everyone alive through the mountain winter. The mathematics of survival had created an impossible situation where cooperation meant starvation and resistance meant immediate death. The breaking point came on February 14th when Irish worker Brian Donnelly attempted to organize an armed resistance against what he called the murdering bastards who've turned us into monsters worse than any wild animal. Donnelly had managed to convince 12 other workers to join his rebellion, appealing to their remaining humanity and their memories of the moral men they had once been before hunger and desperation had transformed them into something unrecognizable. The rebels had begun stockpiling weapons and supplies for a confrontation with Hartwell's group, planning to overthrow the cannibalistic leadership and either attempt to escape through the mountain passes or establish a more humane system of survival until rescue arrived. But their planning was discovered by Brenner's network of informants, men who had become so psychologically dependent on the cannibalistic system that they viewed any threat to it as a threat to their own survival. The confrontation was swift and brutal, occurring during the pre-dawn hours, when most of the camp was asleep and unable to witness or interfere with the violence. Kincaid led a group of loyalists in a coordinated attack on Donnelly's hiding place, claiming later that the rebels had attacked first and forced them to defend themselves in what appeared to be a desperate fight for survival. When the violence ended with the methodical efficiency of a military operation, Donnelly and 4 of his allies were dead, their bodies bearing injuries that clearly indicated deliberate execution rather than combat wounds. The remaining rebels were given a choice that perfectly illustrated the moral bankruptcy of their situation: join the inner circle as full participants in the killing and cannibalism, or be processed themselves as the next meal. 7 of the 8 surviving rebels chose integration, abandoning any pretense of moral resistance in favor of guaranteed survival that required them to participate actively in selecting and killing their former companions. Only one man, Kazimierz Kowalski, refused to participate directly in the murders, though he continued to consume the human flesh that sustained the camp through his detailed documentation of events